Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 29th of January of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the South Donetsk direction where the Russians continue their offensive operation, and for the first time since the end of the battle for Velika Novoselivka, the Russians began moving further in the northwestern direction, but not in the area of Velika Novoselivka, but along 0510 road between the settlement of Velika Novoselivka and the city of Gulyai-Polye. In this video we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the settlement of Novopol. And this is the first scene, the first video from this area for the previous 10 days exactly from these territories. So which means that maybe the Russians will try to test and to check the Ukrainian defense belt in this area, and maybe we are at the beginning of another greatest Russian offensive operation that will be finished somewhere in the area of Gulyai-Polye. So from this perspective, the Russians can begin offensive and advancing further in the northern direction, and then to move in the western direction with the purpose to outflank the city of Gulyai-Polye, to encircle the Ukrainians and to force them to fall back. Of course, this is not going to happen within 1, 2, or 3 days. The Russians are gonna need months to finish this operation. But anyway, if they want to finish this operation in several months, they need to start. First of all, they need to start this operation. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Andriivka fortified area. Today we received first video that confirms Russian presence on the territory of the settlement of Dachne. This morning, different pro-Russian sources reported that the Russians managed to enter the settlement from the east. We haven't adjusted the map because we don't have enough of proofs to confirm Russian control over this part of the settlement, but the Ukrainian side published very interesting video. Video is 1 minute and 30 seconds length. In this video we can see how the Ukrainian drone was flying above one big building in the southeastern part of the settlement, and we see how the Ukrainian drone was coordinating Ukrainian artillery that was bombing this territory. And in this moment we can see that after the building was almost destroyed, reduced to ruins, the Russian soldiers left the building and began running in the eastern direction. Based on this video we have adjusted the map and we have colored the building that was bombed by the Ukrainians in Russian favor. So we don't know for sure what is the current status of the situation, whether the Russians manage to improve their positions or not, but anyway, summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that most likely the final days of the settlement of Dachne has started. The Russians during the previous 24 hours attacked Ukrainian forces as usually in the Andriivka and the Kurakhova pocket. Lots of videos we got from the east area how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian units here, but without any changes on the ground. The only changes are coming from Dachne. Now let's discuss the situation in the Dnipro direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their positions, but as for now it is very difficult to move through the fields, because as you can see when talking about, for example, these fields, the Russians need to cross these territories without normal ground, without normal roads, and we have already discussed the video of the current situation on the ground. For example, this is the conditions the Russians are forced to attack the Ukrainian positions. Obviously it's very difficult, sometimes it's even impossible, and this is the only reason why the Russians currently can't advance fast through the fields, and something like this is happening here. Most likely the Russians are advancing just using the troopers and infantry without even using armored vehicles or infantry fighting vehicles. We are not talking about, of course, tanks. Anyway, despite the weather, the Russians managed to improve their positions at least a little bit, and the Russians managed to cut physically the road to TO515 between the settlement of Yasineva and the settlement of Andriivka. The same story is coming from Novoolenivka area. Today the sources reported that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the settlement of Novoolenivka. This information first was confirmed by the Russian Minister of Defense, and later the Russian sources published the video of how the battle for the settlement took place. In this video we can see lots of episodes, lots of different, let's say, small shorts of how the Russians were attacking the territory of the village, and in the final part of this video we can see how the Russian soldier raised the Russian flag in the eastern part of the settlement. The building was geolocated immediately, so this is the building where the Russians raised the flag, and once again the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation also confirmed control over this territory based on the Russian Minister of Defense report, based on on the geolocations of flags raised in the small village, and based on the geolocations that were provided us before, the territory of Novoolenivka was colored in Russian favor. Furthermore, pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians, after the fall of Novoolenivka, managed to improve their positions in the southwestern direction and to take under control additional 3 lines. So once again, the Russians can't move very fast, they're moving very slowly, but telling the truth, despite the fact that the Russians are moving not so fast, there are not so many villages left. The Russians, since the beginning of battle for this territory, have already captured the settlement of Pushkino, Novoolenivka, Ukrainka, Yasenova, Andriivka, Novooelizavetovka, and maybe the Russians managed to take under control Nadezhinka. It's already up to 7 villages, and just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 villages left, to 7 villages left for the Russians. So it's the same, 50% was already taken. Now let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. Currently there are very heavy clashes in this area. The main activities are taking place in the line between Dachne and Kotlina. If you remember the previous video, we were talking about interesting episode that took place on the territory of Toretsk mine, and based on that video we adjusted the map in Ukrainian favor. We were talking about the movements of Ukrainian forces on the territory of mine, but that video was geolocated wrongly. The real geolocation of that video is coming from the settlement of Dachne. So for example, in this video, once again, let's take a look at this video. We can see the Ukrainian soldiers that were moving through these facilities, and as you can see, the Ukrainians are moving very very careful. As you can see, at least this soldier was trying to check whether the Russians were trying to hide themselves somewhere to the left of his from his side. Anyway, based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Ukrainian favor. This territory were colored and were considered as a territories under Russian control based on the geolocation that was published yesterday by the 155th Mechanized Brigade. Now we see that now we have adjusted the map once again, but as for now, these facilities were colored in Ukrainian favor based on this video. So what does it mean? Currently there are very heavy clashes in this direction. The Ukrainians are sending more and more forces with the purpose to stabilize the situation, with the purpose to force the Russians to fall back and just not allow the Russians to cut the next supply line that goes further in the northern direction. Another important and very interesting video we got from the Pokrovsk direction, the video about 155th Mechanized Brigade. You know that there are lots of scandals about this 155th Brigade that of 150 series, and there was reported that 100, for example, 55ths left their positions, and troopers basically left their group brigades, and due to that fact the Ukrainians suffered significant losses. And now some sources from Ukrainian side start publishing the video of how Ukrainian soldiers of 155th Brigade were moving to the line of combat contact, and they were arrested. As you can see, they have some let's say arrest equipment on their hands that doesn't allow them to escape. So these Ukrainians are saying that their commanders put these things on their hands because they by this action the Ukrainian commanders were trying to prevent this brigade and this at least group of Ukrainian soldiers to leave their positions and to run away from the line of combat contact. So this is the reality in Ukrainian army. Sometimes the Ukrainian commanders are forced to arrest soldiers and to send them to the line of combat contact, otherwise they will run away and escape the Ukrainian forces. So this is the terrible situation in this direction. The Ukrainians are saying that it's a fake, it's not something true, but for now it's very difficult to understand who's telling the truth and who's lying. Furthermore, we got the video from the facilities to the northwest of Kotlina. In this video, we can see 2 Russian soldiers that were attacked by the Ukrainian FPV drones, and based on this video, we have adjusted the map in this point of Kotlina. So we see that from one side, the Russians are trying to advance further in the northwestern direction. From the other side, during the previous several days, the Ukrainians were trying to counterattack the Russians, and they were trying to encircle the Russians on the territory of Kotlina. So there are very heavy clashes here. Furthermore, the Russians during the previous 24 hours published lots of videos videos of how they were FPV droning and attacking the Ukrainian units along the entire city of Pokrovsk. The Russians destroyed lots of equipment, lots of vehicles, lots of temporary deployment point. Currently, it's very difficult to say whether the Russians are going to attack or it's just regular activity from the Russian side with the purpose just to pin down the Ukrainian forces and not to allow them to redeploy their units from one side to another. But when talking about geolocations, we see that most of the geolocations are taking place along the one line. A bit further in the northern direction, we have several buildings that were destroyed by the Russians as a result of FAB strike or as a result of Iskander strike. It seems that the Russians, by all these icons, by all these events, are trying to clear the path before possible offensive operation from the settlement of Novoolenivka in the northern direction with the purpose to take under control the Pokrovsk citadel and to dig in deeper as much as possible. If the Russians somehow, as a result of fast lightning and unexpected attack, can take this high-rise building area, residential area under control, the Ukrainians most likely will not be able to hold their positions for a very long period of time. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinivka direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians took under control several tree lines and fortifications of the armored forces of Ukraine on the way towards the settlement of Vadiana Druga. The Russians are trying to take this settlement in pincers from the west and from the south. Now let's discuss the situation in the Toretsk direction. As we discussed, we have returned back the map configuration on the territory of mine, but even despite all these changes, we still continue receiving updates of how the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russians. This is another video that was published by the Ukrainians today, another episode of how the Ukrainians were trying to restore control over the northern streets of the city of Toretsk. As for today, we didn't adjust the map because Ukraine attack already took place on the territory that was colored in Ukraine's favor yesterday. For example, another important video is coming also from the territory to the north of the Toretsk of mine of Fomiha. In this video, we can see how the Russians were FPV droning and attacking the Ukrainian units and vehicles, and one of the abandoned Ukrainian vehicle was destroyed in the fields to the north of the Toretsk, of the landfill. So as for now, we're not adjusting the map, but obviously we need to. It's very difficult to understand. Not like whether this territory is under complete Ukraine or under complete Russian control. It's just fields, and who controls the landfill controls the fields. So for now, maybe we will keep the map as is, but if we continue receiving updates from this territory, we will adjust the map in Ukraine further as well. Anyway, we see that Ukrainians currently are trying to counterattack the northern part of Toretsk with the purpose to restore control over the territories they lost during the battle for the agglomeration itself. As for now, it's very difficult to understand what is the reason of this, because it's like you have already lost control. I don't know why they're counter-attacking right now. The city of Chasiv Yar, the most important updates are coming from the southern part. Today we got the video that confirms Russian control over the most southern parts of the Chasiv Yar agglomeration. In this video, the Russian stormtroopers were trying to take under control the stronghold in the vicinity of the Zemlyanki micro-district. If the Russians took under control this micro-district, then the situation for the Ukrainians in Zemlyanki would worsen multiple times, significantly. Furthermore, the Russians began bombing and attacking the settlements, already began bombing the settlements around the city of Chasiv Yar. In this video, we can see the Russian aviation strike on Ukrainian positions. This is very important video. This video tells us that the Russian focus is moving further in the northwestern and in the western direction, which means that the battle and the line of combat contact is moving also further in the northern and the northwestern directions. Now let's discuss the situation in the Siversk area. And as you can see, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians intensified their activities in this direction. Currently, it's very difficult to understand whether the Russians are planning to carry out another offensive operation that will lead to nothing, or the Russians are just trying to pin the Ukrainians down and not to allow the Ukrainians to use their reinforcements and reserves here on any other direction. I'll remind you that since the end of 2022, the Russians made probably dozens of attempts to attack the city of Siversk, and all of them failed. The Russians didn't manage to get anything from those attacks. Maybe the Russians are planning to start another one, because every 2-3 weeks the Russians begin another offensive operation with a significant number of vehicles. Maybe it's time for another attack from the Russian side. As for the southern Kupiansk or the Lyman direction, we have small changes on the ground in Ukrainian favor based on the video that was published by the Russian side. These fields and this part of the forest used to be considered as a contested area, because several pro-Russian sources reported about complete control over these territories, but now we have geolocation published by the Russian side that confirms Ukrainian presence and Ukrainian strong control over this territory. As for Ivanovka-Kolodezny situation, during the previous 24 hours nothing happened. As for the northern Kupiansk direction, the same story. The Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions around the settlement of Dvorishne, trying to ruin Ukrainian plans for another counter-offensive operation. And during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to maintain the lines to improve their positions, but without any significant attempts or fast lightning attempts to attack Ukrainian forces. So the Russians are trying to concentrate the critical mass, and after they finish this process, maybe they will begin offensive. Now let's discuss the situation in the Volchansk direction. You know that something tells me that when talking about statistics and about the number of updates from this or that direction, I came to the conclusion that most likely something big is going to start happening in the area of Volchansk. Every single day we start receiving more and more updates of Russian forces at work. We start receiving FAPs. We haven't received FAPs for a very long period of time in this area. Now we start receiving them once again, which means that the Russians, let's say, they redeployed some forces, some in the area of this responsibility, some aviation, some artillery, and of course, if there are artillery forces, aviation forces, units, vehicles, this means that something big is going to happen. Now let's discuss the situation in the Sudzha area. There are very heavy clashes. The Russians published the video, the Ukrainians published the video of the consequences of Iskander attack in the area of Sumy. Most likely another temporary deployment point or the warehouse of the armored forces of Ukraine was destroyed. As for the Sudzha direction itself, another anomalous number of geolocations came to us. As you can see, tens geolocations for the previous 24 hours of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian vehicles using the FPV drones and artillery and aviation. And the same story we got yesterday, almost the same number of icons all over the entire direction. But when talking about the 27th, the number of icons is much less. And the same story about the 26th, so less. So during starting from the 16th till the 26th of January, we didn't receive almost anything. And now 2 days in a row, we are receiving a lot of updates from this direction, which means that the Russians most likely began the preparation before another major offensive operation with the purpose to shorten the Ukrainian positions in this area once again. I'll remind you that in the very near future, the temperature and the weather will stabilize, and then the Russians will have all chances to begin another offensive operation. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.